Ladies and gentlemen, dear LAWGEM project participants, dear colleagues, it is with great honor and pleasure that I now open the second roundtable for today on economic empowerment of women. I will be moderating this session together with my dear colleague, Dr. Mareike Fröhlich. And because we're already behind schedule, we should be really efficient and try to stay within these time limits, 10 minutes per each speaker. So I urge all the speakers to please respect this time frame. Our first speaker will be Professor Antonio Martuscelli. He is an assistant professor in economics at the Department of Law and Economics of the LUMSA University in Palermo. His presentation will be an introductory, presentation explaining the economic position of women today in today's economy and society. So, Professor Martuscelli, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Do I need the microphone?
Yes, of course.
Thank you so much. Really, thank you so much to the organizer for this perfect organization and for giving us the opportunity to say a few words. I'll be very brief because we are all tired, so I'll keep to 10 minutes or possibly less. So just the starting point of the presentation, basically, as you said, is an introduction about the economics behind gender inequality. And the starting point is that even though there have been improvements in gender equality, particularly I'm referring to European countries, still we have large gender gaps that persist in economic terms. There are important gender gaps in educational attainment, in the labor market, so in terms of wages and incomes, in the degree of participation of women to the labor market, and the division of labor between unpaid and paid work in terms of genders. Addressing those gaps, of course, is addressing those gaps is of course important for several reasons, not only for the fairness, social justice, and things that we discuss, but also in economic terms, it's important for achieving sustainable and inclusive economic growth. And in this sense, there are several studies that show that the importance in terms of economic growth of including and solving some of the gender inequalities that persist. Doesn't move. Okay. So standard economics has been traditionally neglected several of the aspects related to gender. There are several problems when it comes to mainstream gender approach, mainstream economics in terms of gender approach. For example, the key measure that we use to measure economic activity or economic outcome, which is gross domestic power, does not include non-market activities and unpaid work. Okay, so these are often disproportionately carried on by women, and so this is one of the problems. And above all, GDP doesn't say anything about the distributional aspect of income, wealth, and resources, and in particular, it doesn't say anything about the gender distribution of resources and women well-being. Apart from this, economics is mainly based on the individual and the unitary household as unit of analysis. But we know that in reality there are a lot of intra-household interaction that are not only of cooperational, but involve some form of conflict or bargaining between members of the household. And so this is another aspect. And finally, the focus on rationality on individual preferences and tastes is key in mainstream economics, but where basically the only constraint or the only important constraint to rational choice is mainly income, disposable income, the resources available. But we know that there are a lot of other constraints that, when we discuss about gender and gender economics, are very important, which involve social norms, cultural attitudes, costumes, and so on. Incorporating a gender perspective into economics requires the acknowledgement of those a series of structural sources of gender inequality that persist, and we need to go beyond the individual and individual choices and preferences to look at ways in which men and women are positioned differently in terms of within the economic areas. And we need to recognize that basically women face different constraints with respect to men, and this influence the choice that they make and the opportunity available to them in the economic area. One of the first structural source of inequality is the gender division between labor, so paid or market activity, and non-market unpaid care work. We know that many economic activities do not involve any market exchange, and women typically are spend more time in this kind of activities than men. And this the gender division between paid work and non-market activity represents one of the key structural sources of inequality. This graph shows, for some of European countries, the time spent in unpaid forms of work for male and female. You can see that in all countries, there is women tend to disproportionately spend more time in unpaid form of works. If we look at the total time spent in total work, which includes both types of activity, paid and unpaid, we see that females actually work more than males in mainly almost all countries across Europe. Of course, in both measures, we have a lot of variation, a lot of heterogeneity across countries, so these measures vary across countries. Another source of gender inequality is basically reflected in paid employment, so in the women's labor force participation rate that are in general on average lower than those of men. In this respect, we had important improvements in the last 30 years in terms of labor force participation. This graph shows the female labor force participation in percentage from beginning of the 90s till 2020 for a sample of European countries and for the EU on average. So we see that there have been important improvements, in particular in some countries. For example, Spain increased by almost 30% the labor force participation. And we can see that there are some important differences across countries that still persist, with some countries doing much better than others. And this is Italy, which has one of the lowest female labor force participation in Europe. But still, gaps persist. This is, again, for the same set of countries, the difference between female and male labor force participation, and we still have, depending on the country, so in many countries we still have important gaps. And the same for the unemployment rate, which tends to be often higher for women than for men. The other structural form of inequality refers to the fact that labor markets are segmented, in the sense that women tend to be concentrated for a set of reasons in more precarious informal forms of employment. So they tend to disproportionately have more part-time jobs or informal jobs or lower quality and precarious jobs. This is reflected then in what we call the gender pay gap in the wages that women have on the labor market. So this show the hourly earning for women and men in different countries, and here as well. Generally, we have a gender pay gap. Here you see on the vertical axis, you see the gender pay gap in percentage. So for the EU 27 is approximately 15%. So there is a lot. There is variation across country, but in some countries can reach also 20-25%. And finally, not only labor or the labor market is a source of problem, but there are other aspects related to the economic situation in terms of gender that are important. For example, in terms of education, where women are largely missing from a set of careers that then the science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, or, for example, about the ownership and control of assets and wealth, which are also tend to be unequally distributed between men and women. Another important aspect is about the financial market, so access to financial services and financial market that are very important. And here as well, we see that women have less or more difficult access to financial market. And for example, here we have an indicator of the percentage of individuals that borrow any money in the last year from a financial institution, and both for males and females. You can see that the access to the financial market is tends to be much lower for females, and just to conclude, these structural inequalities, these structural sources of inequality translate then into differences into welfare, well-being between gender, and in lower incomes, wealth, and well-being. And one indicator that we have is the welfare outcome is the risk of falling into poverty or social exclusion. These are the latest data for 2019. You can see that the risk, the personal risk of poverty and social exclusion, then the percentage tends to be, the incidence tends to be higher between female than male across almost all countries. So just to conclude, there are persistent gaps, gender gaps in many important economic domains. Those structural inequalities are present in terms of time division between market and non-market activity, in the labor market, in the participation rate, and in other key assets like the financial market. The final outcome is this is a gender unequal economic structure. And finally, two important things: the need to incorporate this dimension, the gender focus, into both economic teaching and research. And then, of course, the key point is how to design policy to address these structural sources of inequality. Okay, done. Almost on time.
Thank you, Antonio. And yeah, it's also my pleasure to be here and also to have the opportunity to moderate together with Mirjana this very great roundtable. And I was really looking much forward to do it. So thank you, Dragica, for organizing the event. And I have the pleasure to introduce Nikola Ilić, who is an assistant professor in law and economics at the University of Belgrade, Faculty of Law. And he's currently teaching principle of economics, economic analysis of law, and the economics of the EU integration. And I'm really, really glad that we met again, because I know Nikola, we met the first time years ago when he was a research scholar at our institute. So, and yeah, I'm happy that you're here and that you join us with a presentation on the gender pay gap. So the floor is yours. Thanks.
Thank you so much. First of all, I would like to express my deep gratitude to Professor Vujadinović and Professor Kristoffersson for organizing such a great event and for everything they did and they are still doing within the Law and Gender Project. It is my great pleasure and honor to be here today and to be able to present in front of such a great audience. As you may see, my topic is the gender pay gap, or why do women earn less than men. I have to say that this is a part of an ongoing project, and today I'm just going to present some of the main findings within the given time frame. And of course, I hope that I'll get some comments and questions that I'll be able to implement in the final version of the paper that will hopefully be prepared and published by the end of this year. So with that being said, why do women earn less than men? To answer this question, first of all, we have to define the gender pay gap, or to say what is the gender pay gap. And in literature, there is a broad consensus that the gender pay gap is a systemic difference between the average wages of women and men. To put it simple, if you have 10 men on one side and 10 women on the other side, and if you have their wages and simply calculate the average wage for men and for women and then compare those two values, you'll get the gender pay gap. The gender pay gap as such has many different aspects, but today I'm going to emphasize legal aspects and economic aspects. When it comes to law, there is a well-established principle of equal pay for work of equal value. In Europe, it was established by Treaty of Rome in 1957 and reconfirmed by ECJ case law, and also in every national jurisdiction, the same principle is introduced through national legislation and collective agreements. So, to put it simple, if you have a huge gender pay gap, that could be a strong indication that you have violation of these legal norms. And it's not only about legal norms, but also if you have a huge gender pay gap, then you may have adverse economic consequences. And in literature, in recent studies, they show that by closing the gender pay gap could increase women's participation in the workforce, and as a consequence, you may have a significant increase in GDP per capita. So it's not only about violating legal norms and principle of equal pay for work of equal value, but it's also about adverse economic consequences. So now, when we know a little bit more about that, to see what is the current state of play, what is the gender pay gap in different countries and different regions. So first of all, many countries started to measure the gender pay gap relatively recently, and we still do not have data for all the countries, but still for the European Union, we may say that based on the EU Commission analysis, that on average the gender pay gap is 14%, meaning that men earn 14% more than women in the EU. In the US, it's slightly different, but it's even wider, the gender pay gap. It's around 18%, and in Asia and Africa, it's even wider than that. It's 20% in Asia and 25% in Africa, and of course, this is a raw estimate, UN estimate, so we still do not have data for all the countries. And if we go into detail, you'll see that in every region, every single country has different gender pay gaps. So, and you may see this gray area here. So this is like the Balkan Peninsula and Western Balkans. We still do not have official data, but within this project, I try to collect the data from national competent authorities and to calculate the average wages and to calculate basically the the gender pay gap, and for this region, on average, is 16% based on those calculations. So it's somewhere between the EU and the US average. And when it comes to Serbia, it's 14.5, so it's relatively close to European average. So now when we see that different countries have different pay gaps, the question is, what are the main causes of the gender pay gap? Why do we have those differences? So just to present some of the main points of view that you may find in literature. Of course, there is a huge literature when it comes to gender economics and gender pay gap, but these are just some of the key or the most important authors and points of view. So Jacobsen, in her book, Gender Economics, basically she explained that there are three main causes of gender pay gap: human capital, compensating differentials, and discrimination. I'm not going to go into detail due to the limited time that I have, but the first two reasons are connected to productivity of women, and the last one is connected to purely to discrimination against women. Goldin, also one of the most influential authors in this field, a professor from Oxford University, she concluded the gender pay gap depends on age, cohort, and occupation. And this is really interesting finding. She had huge pool of data, and those conclusions are really valuable. Because she concluded that during different stages in women's lives, there is a different gender pay gap. So, for example, between 20s, in their 20s, the gender pay gap is relatively narrow or does not exist. And then from 30s to 40s, it's getting wider and wider. And she explained that because women today decide to have children and to be devoted to their family, and therefore their productivity is getting lower and they earn less. And that she confirmed that by analyzing cohorts or different generations. So if you go 50 years, like 50 years ago, women had children in their 20s, and then you may find the biggest gender pay gap, and in their 30s and 40s it was shrinking. So before different generations have different fluctuations in gender pay gap, and that also confirms the first conclusion that age matters. And also, Goldin concluded that occupation really matters, because occupations that have flexible working hours, they have smaller gender pay gap, because women, when they are pregnant or during maternity leave, they still can work. They have flexible working hours, they can work from home, and then there is a smaller gender pay gap. And occupations that do not have flexible working hours, they usually have a huge gender pay gap. Especially, for example, CEOs and positions like that, demanding 24/7 to be available all the time, basically. So they have the huge gender pay gap. And something similar you may find in the studies published by the European Commission, that women on average earn less than men due to sectoral segregation, glass ceiling, which is actually occupation explained by Goldin, and the pay discrimination, which is pure discrimination against women, paying less simply because somebody is a woman. And also you may find point of view presented by Boris Senko. I have to say in advance that I do not agree with these findings, but still you may find that in literature. So basically she said that the gender pay gap does not exist, and those differences between wages are due to the choices that women are making. So they are less productive, they choose not to work, and that's why we have those differences. So as I said, I do not agree with this conclusion, but still you may find that in literature. So if we consider all those causes or reasons behind the gender pay gap, I made basically conclusion that we may create two separate groups or types of gender pay gap. And the first type is the gender pay gap that occurs due to the different productivity of men and women, like personal choices, human capital, level of education, skill they possess, and so on. So that is related to productivity, and productivity or marginal product of labor is a legitimate ground for different payments. So, here we come to adjusted pay gap, because going to the beginning when I explained like to calculate average for men and women, it's just an average. You didn't take into account level of their education, their skills, their productivity, and so on. So if you really have to calculate the real gender pay gap, the difference between wages of men and women, then you'll have to adjust those values to include their education, their background, their skills, their productivity in essence. So this is basically the first type of gender pay gap. And the second type is the gender pay gap that occurs due to discrimination against women. And just to emphasize, when it comes to legal aspects, this first type, we don't have a violation of a principle equal pay for work of equal value because we have different productivity. So when it comes to the first type of gender pay gap, we do not have violation of that principle. And when it comes to the second type of the gender pay gap, now suddenly we have a violation of that principle because we have work of equal value and we do not have equal earnings. So that's why discrimination against women, of course, is not a legitimate ground for pay discrimination. And just briefly to conclude, the gender pay gap reduction is a double-edged sword. It could contribute to economic development, but only when used with care. Before reducing the gender pay gap, one should analyze the reasons behind the gap or the type of the pay gap. And also different countries need different approaches. But for example, if when it comes to the first type of the gender pay gap, or the gender pay gap that is caused by the differences in productivity, the government should introduce incentives to basically to increase productivity of women, to enable flexible working hours, working from home, and so on. So to increase productivity, but not to close the gap directly. Because by closing the gap directly, simply you are equalizing people that are not equally productive. So, and in that way, you may create adverse economic incentives and economic consequences, adverse economic consequences. But in other case, when we have basically the gender pay gap based on discrimination against women, then government, of course, should react and should enable more efficient enforcement of the equal pay principle. So, for the end, just to conclude, I'm gonna quote one of the most prominent public figures in the U.S. fighting for equal pay, and she said, "We still are not paid equally, and if you believe that it's a myth, do the math." I agree, but when you're doing the math, please remember, if you calculate just average wage of men and average wage of women, it doesn't say a lot. You will not get a full picture. So you have to include different factors like level of their education, their productivity in one sense, in one word, and then you should do the math. And she also said unequal pay hurts women, hurts their families, and hurts us all. I also agree, but under condition that we are talking about a type 2 of gender pay gap, or gender pay gap that is caused by discrimination against women. Then we may basically have a decrease in women's participation in the workforce and a significant adverse economic consequences. And of course, we should react and we should enable more efficient enforcement, and we should protect principle of equal pay for work of equal value, but not in the case of the type 1 of gender pay gap. I'm sorry, I hope that I'm on time, and thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much for this intellectually stimulating discussion and for shedding some light on this really important issue for all of us. Now, our next panelist is Professor Tatjana Jevremović Petrović, a full-time professor of company law at the Faculty of Law, University of Belgrade. Unfortunately, Professor Jevremović Petrović is not present in this room today. She will be joining us online, hopefully. I hope she can hear us right now, and maybe can turn on her microphone so that we can confirm that she is present online. Tatjana, are you here?
Hello, Mirjana. I'm trying to connect my computer, but unfortunately I cannot. So I will turn you through my mobile phone. It's not a problem for you to see me. I had the presentation being sent to you, and I don't know whether you are available to show it for me. Okay, great. So I will tell you when to switch on the slide. That is okay with you.
Yes, thank you. We hear you perfectly, and the presentation has now been shared, so I hope you see it also on your screen.
Yes, I do. Thank you very much. Okay, hello everybody. Good day to you all in Belgrade. It's a little bit strange to be not in Belgrade on the Belgrade conference. I'm particularly sorry for missing all dear friends in Belgrade, but I hope we will have another chance to see each other.
So to start with, I will just say that the presentation I'm going to have today was part of the LAWGEM Erasmus Plus project, on which me, including my colleagues Jelena Lepetić and Mareike Fröhlich, had the chance to write a chapter on the involvement of women in various aspects of business law, or more particularly on gender equality in business law. So you can switch to another, next slide. Thank you very much. So my task was to write on the economic empowerment of women. Professor Lepetić was discussing various issues of dispute resolution bodies and decision making in companies, and Mareike was doing a perfect job in issues of gender equality in trade and investment law. I would like to express my gratitude to my co-authors. We cooperated really nicely, and I'm really proud of our result in this chapter. So today I would like to present those issues I was in charge of doing research, and in particular of the issue of economic empowerment of women through entrepreneurship, and various issues of gender equality in terms of entrepreneurship. So to start with, I will just remind you that EU gender equality strategy, which was done in 2020, emphasized that there is a need to make a progress in gender equality in Europe, and among main pillars of this equality, it is the equal position in society and economy, and it is achieved in various aspects of economic activities, including gender equal business environment, encouragement of gender smart funding and financing, improvement of balanced business decision making, and etc. On the next slide, you will see that unfortunately, current situation is not so great, because according to report of World Economic Forum in 2020, economic participation and opportunities of women are regressing. It would take 257 years to achieve gender parity, in particularly because females are underrepresented in the labor market. They face inequality in financial terms in regard to wage and income. My colleague Nikola Ilić was a great pretext for my presentation, by the way, so thank you very much for great introduction and being able to continue his research and conclusions. And finally, it is also due to a lower level of access to financial investments like credit, bank loans, also access to land or other property and other financial products. So to skip next slide, which is saying that women's entrepreneurship has great economic potential. On the next slide, you will see a very disturbing, I would say, statistical data. First of all, it is said that women represent 52% of total EU population, according to EU official statistics. And among these numbers, it is very sad to see that women accounted for only 29% of total number of entrepreneurs in Europe, which was research done in 37 European countries in 2012. And among them, only 5 to 15% are taking part in high-tech business ventures and those which are dealing with high-tech technology. On the same time, these statistical data are disturbing if you know that, again, according to statistics, level of education of women in many European countries is usually above and higher than the educational level of men. Similar results we have in the Republic of Serbia. For example, 33% of female out of all sole entrepreneurs are women, and only 16.3% of them were single owners of companies. According to newest data sources I collected, female are, for example, only taking part in 24% in holding managerial position in company. 25% of female are owners of the companies. So overall, we have a very low level of female participation in entrepreneurship. On the next slide, you will see why and how we can identify these statistical results. First of all, it is obvious that we have a lower intensity of entrepreneurial activity within female population. But not only that, when we take a look a little bit further, we see that they earn less. They are also usually in those business ventures which are underdeveloped in terms of they remain on the small or medium level, which is more risky then again and prone to liquidation or insolvency. And it is also very usually under the strong impact of market fluctuation risks. Finally, there are certain restricted areas of entrepreneurial activities which are typical for female entrepreneurship, and usually it is provision of services. The most typical ones are those concerning healthcare or the services in an educational sector. So overall, we have quite many aspects which are related to why women are less represented within entrepreneurship sector. On the next slide, you will also see that when entrepreneurs decide on the entrepreneurship project, they're usually for typical, let's say, startup decisions. And they include survival purposes, so you do not have choice, so you will be entrepreneur. Other option is a lifestyle choice. Usually you choose to be entrepreneur because it suits your individual needs, your hobbies, your working hours, etc. Sometimes, nevertheless, you wish to start a business because you want to develop further certain area of entrepreneurship. You have competitiveness as a main reason or further development. And finally, very rarely, there are startup decisions based on revolutionary so-called enterprises. Why I made italic first two ones, because these are typical for female entrepreneurship. Those which are in regard to development or revolutionary usually stay out of option for females. On the next slide, you will see why female are again facing various obstacles. But to be honest, there are certain obstacles which are common to all entrepreneurs, irrespective of the fact whether they come from various vulnerable groups, including female, in this context. And they, first of all, deal with problems in regard to funds and adequate financing. Then there are various regulatory, administrative constraints, low educational level, lack of information, and social acceptance. And all of them, as you can see on the next slide, are usually specific barriers related to females because they have particular social reasons. They have particular problems to combine their personal life with their business choice. They have usually problems in relation to access to certain professions because they are reserved for men only. And finally, they have particular problems in regard to funding. On the next slide, you will see that usually it is the lack of financial independence which is providing the most typical problem for a woman to start entrepreneurship activity, because she is either financially not independent or dependent. She's usually depending on the family sources. Very rarely she's owner of the property. I was really shocked, to be honest, when I saw statistics of the ownership in the Republic of Serbia, in particularly on the agricultural land, and to see that it was lower than 10% in the ownership of women. So it is obvious that without financial independence and sources, female cannot start up their own businesses. So for a result, female entrepreneurship is lacking financial resources, and therefore it stays quite low in scope. Without external finance, it cannot grow, and usually it stays on, as I already said, small or eventually medium level. Finally, if we take a look at bank loans, even though they are formally equal to all, irrespective of the sex, usually other decisive criteria will decide that female are usually prevented even to have external funding, among which bank loans are the most typical ones. So how can we solve the problem? First of all, there is necessity to do something called affirmative action. There is a need of special funding for female entrepreneurship, so dedicated to this type of entrepreneurship. Then there is a need for private, in particular direct funding, which will again target female entrepreneurship. And it is also more than welcome to have so-called business angels being included in the scheme of financing female entrepreneurship. European Commission underlined that financing is the most important aspect of female entrepreneurship, and is dealing with various projects involving direct and private financing. Also, apart from that, as you can see on the next slide, there are other positive affirmative action. European Union noticed that when it comes to female entrepreneurship, education is really important aspect of fostering entrepreneurship in this population, and it is important to remove certain stereotypes, to educate on entrepreneurship, women how to and when and under what conditions they can start up their own business. So it is very important to spread various networks and other ways of spreading knowledge to attract more female in doing entrepreneurial activities. Finally, there is important aspect of social attitude towards improving position of female within entrepreneurship sector. And on the next slide, you can see that there are various internet and other platforms to serve that purpose. They are intended to attract and inform women, to connect them with private investors, to connect various investment projects in certain areas. And there are various websites particularly developed during last few years to encourage and connect and inform women on various prospects of entrepreneurship. As I see, the main problem remains in the attitude toward education and attitude in terms of social acceptance of female turning their hobbies, their side works, etc., to something which can grow and which can turn to be a good prospect for particularly those female who are unemployed. Thank you very much. I think that was enough for beginning, and I would really like to discuss further if we can very quickly of my presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tatjana, for that nice presentation and for your nice words. I also have the pleasure to introduce Jelena Lepetić. We wrote together with Tatjana the chapter, and it was really a very, very nice cooperation and very efficient. She's an associate professor for company law and also the vice dean for international cooperation here at the university and at the faculty. And she will present the really hot topic on women in corporate boards, because that's always, it's discussed for a long time, but it's still hot, so to say.
Well, thank you, Mareike.
The floor is yours.
Thank you. First of all, allow me to express my gratitude to Professor Dragica Vujadinović and Professor Ivana Krstić for inviting me to this conference. This is on my personal behalf, but on my professional behalf, in the capacity of Vice Dean for International Cooperation, I also want to express the gratitude of the Faculty of Law to Professor Dragica Vujadinović, whose contribution regarding the activities in relation to international cooperation, which involves our Faculty of Law, is huge and enormous. So this conference is only one of the numerous activities which are initiated and undertaken by Professor Vujadinović. So please just thank you, Professor Vujadinović. So now I may start with the presentation. So something is
One
not...
more time.
Okay. So today I will speak about the women in corporate boards. The gender perspective in corporate governance involves not only this hot topic, as we already heard, but also the other ones which are closely connected to the board diversity, which is the remuneration of directors and disclosure of remuneration policy. But today, because of the time limits, I will speak only about the composition of the board's nomination and appointments of directors. So I was wondering, what is the idea actually of this topic, and are there any reasons for fostering gender diversity? Because when we speak about the company law perspective and gender perspective together, we should ask ourselves whether there are economic rationales for fostering gender diversity. There were so many empirical studies and researchers done this and asked themselves this question about the economic rationale for fostering gender diversity. And the answer is that there is no clear answer. Some of them, they think that there is this rationale, and some of them, they say, no, there is no. So there is no clear link between board diversity and corporate performance. When the shareholder establishes company, he does it because he wants a dividend distribution, so a maximum wealth, and therefore he appoints, or she appoints, or the company, another company appoints the directors who may perform well. So is there anything about the gender? I believe that we should turn to the fundamental right of equality between men and women and ethical reasons, which are the proper justifications for fostering gender diversity, and not the economic rationale and the economic performance of the company. Because, as I already said, there is no clear link. But this economic rationale was mentioned in 2011 Green Paper EU Corporate Governance Framework, and also the increase of transparency of board diversity policy was mentioned again in 2012 in Action Plan European Company Law and Corporate Governance, a modern legal framework for more engaged shareholders and sustainable companies. So this was the idea, but there is no enough empirical data which supports it. So what are the statistics? So I was wondering, what is the current situation? Why this is the current situation? Which actions are already taken? What are the possible measures which may be undertaken? And what is the proper way forward? So what may I recommend? So let's start about the statistic. What is the average shares of women in boards of listed companies which are registered in the EU? You may see here on this slide that this number is increasing. So starting from 8.5% in 2003, today in 2020. So according to European Institute for Gender Equality, it is 32.3%. So many things were done in between. So the best results are achieved in France. So where 46.3% of presidents, board members, and employee representatives are women, and the lowest percentage is achieved in Estonia, and it is 8.3%. When it comes to the percentage of women who are CEOs, executives, and non-executives, best results are achieved in Sweden. This percentage is 27.5, and the lowest, which was surprising for me, is in Luxembourg. It is only 4.3%. So what are the reasons? There are, of course, many general ones. I believe that they are mentioned many times today and yesterday, such as the traditional gender roles, and as we also heard from Nikola, double burden, so-called educational choices. But regarding the women as directors, it is also a specificity of director position, because this position requires mobility and continuity, which are needed for the leadership position. So what is the situation in Serbia? As you also can see, those are the statistical data from the Statistic Office of the Republic of Serbia. And unfortunately, the newest data are from 2018, although they are published now in 2021, actually last year. So also the number was increasing from 2014 to 2016, from 17.3% to 19.3%, but it decreased in 2018, which was again interesting for me, to 19%. In December 2020, and these are now the data from the Serbian Business Registers Agency, we may see that representatives and directors who are women actually are 69% of men. Women are only 22.6%. And there is also this number of 7.5 foreigners. So those are the natural persons who do not have national citizenship of Republic of Serbia. So we don't know whether they are men or women. So those data are only about the men and women who have Serbian citizenship. So what is already undertaken in the EU and also over the world? So in 1984, actually, it is easiest to say, there was one recommendation on the positive action for women. In 1996, also recommendation on the balanced participation of women and men in the decision-making process. But I would like to emphasize that those are much broader actions. So they do not cover only economic decision-making, which is, again, not only the directors. It can be, for example, the arbitrators, but also the other spheres such as political sphere. So this is just some broader actions, but those are also important regarding the women in corporate boards. In 2011, Women on Board Pledge for Europe was launched, but unfortunately, this was not so successful. Only something like 20 companies actually applied this pledge. So this was nothing special, but it was a try. In 2011, there was a resolution by the European Parliament on women in business leadership, which urged companies to reach 30% of women in boards by 2015 and 40% by 2020. European Parliament also again said the same in the next year, and when EU Commission saw that nothing will happen, then change, they made a proposal for a directive on improving the gender balance, but only among the non-executive directors of companies which are listed in stock exchanges and related measures in 2012. So only those non-executive positions and only listed companies, which mean companies whose shares are traded on stock exchanges, which are registered in the EU and which are large. This is also important because small and medium listed companies are not covered. But again, nothing happened. It is 2022 now, so 10 years later, we just hear the words. For example, President von der Leyen, she announced the determination to move forward with the proposal, but nothing happened. And also German and Dutch governments supported recently, again, this proposal. But we still don't know its destiny. Nothing is really happening. And let me just remind you that there are no rules on structures of bodies and management of companies which are harmonized in the EU law. So we don't really have any important rules which are covering only this issue. So which are the possible solutions? Some of them are really not so intrusive to company law, but some others are. Why this is important? Because, as I already said, if you are a shareholder and if you invest and if you have a share, you would like to appoint a director who you like. So if your choices are limited, maybe then you even will not vote. So many things in corporate governance may be changed and maybe even limited by some of these solutions. So one, the least intrusive, is creating the pool of candidates of underrepresented gender. And this may increase the probability of the selection of women, but it may not prevent something which is called gender matching heuristic. This is very interesting because there are statistical data that if the former director was a man, a new director will be again man. So this can do nothing about this, but what it can do is that it may prevent some other phenomenon which is called golden skirts. This means that the same women are directors in many large companies. And also I came to some very interesting data from Norway. When they introduced quotas, I will mention them a little bit later, it happened that they actually noticed that many of women who were directors had the same surname. So what happened? They were the wives, the sisters, the members of the family of the other directors. So they had quotas, but nothing special actually changed. It wasn't about the performance, about the ability. So this is this golden skirt phenomenon. But if you have a pool of candidates which is wider, then this may be prevented. Again, the other possible solution is to promote gender equality. Many programs of training may be applied, or the companies which have best results may be rewarded. Also, the idea of reputation is very important, and therefore establishing the policy on diversity in boardrooms and disclosure of statistics on men and women who are directors may be the important one. So the last one are quotas, which may be voluntary and mandatory. For example, 8 EU member states have national quotas from 25 to 40%. 10 have taken a softer approach, such as, for example, Spain. which has just a recommendation to apply quotas, and 9 EU countries have not taken any substantial measures. I will just mention briefly that in that 2012 directive proposal, which I mentioned, the idea was to establish the quota of 40% of number of non-executive positions in board of large listed companies, which should be held by women, with 2 exceptions, but I will invite you just to read because it's in my paper because of the time limit. And I will just skip to my conclusions. What is the way forward? So what should be the recommendations, which are my conclusions? So quotas should be at least recommended by national legislators. Why? We see that in all the countries where those quotas are at least recommended, the percentage of women in boardrooms is higher. If quotas are mandatory, so if there is some kind of sanctions, if you don't reach this quota, this is the difference between the voluntary and mandatory quota, only large listed companies and state-owned enterprises, for example, this is the case in Slovenia, should be obliged by these rules. So only the big ones, because they have a huge reputation risks, and also they can really influence to others. And the third conclusion that I made is that the type of implemented board system should not be relevant. So is it 1-tier board, 2-tier board, mixed board? This is not relevant. But as we saw from the practice of these countries, non-executives board positions are more suitable for interference because executive positions deal with day-to-day job. So thank you. I'm sorry if I...
Thank you, Jelena, for your wonderful presentation. You raised some extremely important policy issues, but since time is really scarce and we do not have much room left, we have to skip right away to our next panelist. This is Professor Teresa Ponton Aricha, a substitute professor of tax law at the University of Cadiz. I'm going to help you with the presentation. I'm sorry. Just a second. This one, yes. Just let me share it for those who participate online so that everyone can see. Okay, here it goes. Professor, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much.
You can start like this.
First of all, I want to thank you, the organization, for inviting me and for giving me the opportunity of share some ideas with you. I'm going to be so brief, don't worry. Sorry, it's okay?
It cannot be moved.
I can move a bit.
Mm-hmm.
No? No. And right now we are talking about taxes. And the first question is why? Why we are talking about taxes? Everyone here pays taxes. In what way? We can pay taxes through consumption. We can pay taxes by the real estate. By oh, okay, sorry.
You can come closer.
Maybe better. Better? No. So everybody here pays taxes without exception, regardless social classes, gender, education, or anything. On the other hand, everyone here has a profit for that taxes that we are paying. This is a fact that can be preached to everyone. Taxation goes beyond social classes, social barriers to anything. It goes anyway, in these 2 different ways. The state has a series of normative facilities in a very pronounced way when we are talking about taxation, which allowed it to guide the citizens to make some concrete actions. It's not the same if you pay less or more it had a significant weight. The option to pay a less burden made the citizen act. That is so important. It's not a coercion, it's not a directly way to force the citizens, but it helps. At the end, it is a huge element for the decision making. So, a fair taxation is essential for the sustainability of the public expenditure and the welfare state. And all of us have to contribute. Equality and equity in taxation make taxes good. It means that it's important for us, as you can see, how we tax, how we collect, and how we are going to spend. So, if the system is harmful from the gender perspective, it will be a no fair tax system. Most of the systems in the European countries have evolved in the last 20 years so much. They have been taking in consideration the concept of the traditional family, with a father who obtains the income and a mother who takes care of the households and the children. However, this approach is no longer valid. Our tax system needs to adapt, needs to change to a new reality, because right now this reality gives some privilege and penalizes the decision of making a different family and penalizing sometimes women. So the next question is taxation gender neutral? As you can imagine, the answer is no. This question is fundamental because we are dealing with taxpayer, we are dealing with profits, number, and when you see a number, the number you could see is no gender, it has no gender perspective, but it's a fallacy. We are taxing people. We are taxing men, women, and third gender, and that's really important. We must be aware always that taxation is so linked to the sovereignty. Taxation serves for attend the citizens' needs. Also, taxation provides economic incentives that affect the consumer, the labor market, the investment. So, it's essential to introduce a gender perspective in taxation, not only in how we tax, also in how we spend the taxes. This neutral language is hiding discrimination sometimes, and a modern tax system can do that. The problem is that it's so difficult to identify that discrimination, because we all been talking about earned wage, taxpayer, and you need to go beyond to discover the discrimination. Here are some data that are from Spain. In the first one, we can see the number of the persons who fill in their tax returns. As you can see, the number of men is higher. But more important is the second one, where we can see the average of where women and men are so different. The average of the wage in personal income of men are significantly higher. The last one are the earnings related with the professional activity. Also, it's higher when we are talking about men. There are essential data that right now are showing the Spanish administration. It's a new perspective because the administration never give us that kind of information. It means that the system is changing. They are introducing a new perspective. In the last slide, there was a thing that was so curious. We can choose our gender. If you are going to fill in a tax return, you only have two options, men or women. It happened the same when we are talking about family. As I said before, the system was built under a family who has a mother who takes care of the households and the children, and a father who was the family provider. The men used to stay in the same job for maybe a time life, but nowadays it doesn't work. Lifetime work is rare. Marriage often ends in a divorce, and parenthood is not tied to the concept of heterosexuality. So this system is no longer valid. The European Union recommends to remove this from all the European Union because it has a double effect. For the married couple, here in the family unity, it's essential if you are married or not. It's the main requirement to apply this tax system. If you are married, you can fill a joint declaration. But it means that the second earner get a higher tax rate because we made just one declaration, and the taxation in Spain, as in all Europe, is progressive. But there are no other options. If you compare the individual and the joint transaction, you can see how the composition of the family is not left to the discretion of the taxpayer. It's predetermined by law. There is no other option. There is no way for a typical family, and it shows us this is the normal, the regular, how a family should be. Something that is not real. In Spain, we also have a maternity deduction. A working mother with a kid under 3 years could have a deduction on 1,200 euros per year, but it has some requirements. Look at the number of women and men who fill in the tax return and ask for that deduction. At first glance, we can see that is a gender measure. It's good, maybe, but when you analyze the requirement, also is a fallacy, because you need to be a woman. The kids must be under 3 years. The intention of this of this law, of this deduction, is to avoid working mothers, to quit her job. The requirement was be a mother, have a kid under 3 years, the guardianship, and a work activity. So the problem is that these norms affirm that a woman, in addition to working, must take care of a minor. Not the man, the woman. The take care role is in the law assigned to a woman. The men are excluded from this law. It's a small exception when a man can ask for it. So at the end, this measure that looks a gender proper measure had a strong part of discrimination. Also, this measure is only 1,200 euros. That is nothing for a decision making when the working mother is thinking, what am I going to do? Should I quit my job? Just to finish, in conclusion, tax is essential and tax have no barrier. Go beyond classes, beyond gender, beyond everything. Equality should become a priority for the governments when they are taxing and always when they are making their budgets. So if the system is harmful from the point of view of gender, it will be no a fair tax system. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Teresa, for this interesting presentation on taxation. To be honest, that seems to me always the most problematic and difficult one, because when you do your own tax declaration, I'm always struggling, and I hope I'm not the only one in the room. So, yeah. No. I hope that Eleonor is with us online. Eleonor, are you there?
Yes, I'm there.
Perfect. So I have the pleasure to introduce Eleonor Kristoffersson. She is professor of law at the School of Law, Psychology and Social Work at Örebro University in Sweden, and she's also visiting professor in business law at Linköping University, and she also works a lot is a taxation lawyer. And she will talk about gender equitable taxation and the relevance of taxation for gender equality. And she will introduce an interesting problem, or not a problem, but some laws which address a very specific gender issue. And I would say the floor or the online room is yours, Eleonor.
Thank you so much. And do you hear me properly?
Yes. Oh. Yes, we can.
Perfect. Yeah. I'm sorry that I can't be in Belgrade today. I'm attending a tax conference in Düsseldorf at the moment and going to another one in Munich on Monday. So I'm in Germany at the moment. But I'm Swedish, and I met many of you in Örebro just a month ago, and I hope to meet you all. Where is my presentation? Yes, and I hope to meet you all again in Belgrade. No, not in Belgrade, in Palermo in October. Let's see. I just thought that I shared my presentation, but yeah. All right.
Eleonor, we will take you. Just say next slide from here. So.
All right. Okay. Yeah. So what I'm going to talk about today connects very well to the previous presentation, because I'm going to talk about the abolishing of joint taxation of spouses in Sweden in the 1970s, why Sweden has not introduced a tampon tax, reduced value-added tax rate on feminine hygiene projects, and then make short concluding analysis. The next slide, please. Well, the abolishing of joint taxation in Sweden that happened successively in the 1960s, 1970s, and was an important part of the emancipation of women movement in Sweden. So actually the compulsory joint taxation of spouses was abolished already in 1965. And then the joint taxation for income tax purposes, so the joint taxation of earned income, was completely abolished in 1971. So since then, all spouses are assessed for tax purposes separately. And but we actually kept the joint taxation of wealth tax until the wealth tax was abolished in Sweden in 2008. 1907. And that was because it was considered more important to prevent tax planning in the field of wealth tax, where all the wealth was distributed among the family. So the family was actually the tax subjecting for the wealth tax. Next slide, please. The joint taxation in Sweden then in the 1970s, some deductions like the basic allowance, you know, that you're not taxed on the first income that you earn, that was double for spouses. That was sort of tax neutral. So when the spouses were taxed together, they also had two basic allowances or two basic deductions. And if one of the spouses had a total loss and actually had a negative income, then the other spouse could deduct that loss. But then, and I suppose that is quite similar as in Spain, when calculating the progressive income tax, the spouses were seen as a unit. So the two spouses were actually taxed together, so you can say that the woman's income was laid on top of the man's income. And the special tax system for spouses led normally to that the spouses were paid less tax, but it could also result in that the spouses were actually heavier taxed than single persons, and we had some actually also some tax avoidance rules there in the end before the joint taxation was abolished completely, that prevented or that also included cohabitants, so that you couldn't like circumvene the joint taxation by just being a cohabitant without being married. Next slide, please. And I think it's relevant to ask the question why the abolishment of joint taxation is seen as an important step in Swedish women's history, because it is actually, if you read Swedish women's history, then you will see this year 1971, and that the joint taxation was abolished then, and that was very important. And the idea behind it is that married women became economically independent, and that the women's right to earn their own living took an important step forward, when also married women were considered as economically independent from men. And as I mentioned previously, since previously women's income was placed on top of the men's income, not much was left of the women's income after taxes, and that discouraged women to work, of course. I mean, their income weren't worth very much, so it was better that they stayed at home and took care about the children, basically. So this made married women economically dependent on men. And we also had some other important reforms in the 1970s. And one of the important reform here was the parental leave reform, and that there was a parental insurance, and where men and women were allowed to share the parental leave freely behind them, so they could actually decide if the woman or the man would like to stay at home with a child already then, back then in 1974, so it was not maternity leave, but actually parental leave already then. And then I just mentioned it here also that the free right to abortion was introduced at that time as well in 1975, and the reason that I included it now is that I included it here is not actually that it has so much to do with the tax law, but that it's a hot topic now with the debate in the US. So we can move to next slide. The other thing that I would like to bring up today is the so-called tampon tax, or the reduced value-added tax rate on feminine hygiene products. And there is a possibility to introduce such a reduced rate according to the European Union value-added tax system. And as you can see here at the map, the light gray countries, those are the ones that apply 0 to 9% value-added tax on feminine hygiene products. The dark gray apply 10 to 20% value-added tax, and the red ones, they apply more than 20% value-added tax on feminine hygiene products. And maybe this is in a way a little bit surprising, because one could expect that Sweden, which was very early in trying to achieve the equality between men and women in the tax system, if you look at the income tax, so why don't they introduce this tax that really, the aim of it is to not to discriminate women economically only because they have their the period. And it says here also that Swedish women, that they pay up to like 7,000 euro during a lifetime on feminine hygiene products. But still, we apply 25% value-added tax on feminine hygiene products, even though we have the possibility to apply a reduced rate or even a zero rate on them. So why is that? And we can move to the next slide. There has been some small debate on it, but very little political debate actually on introducing a reduced value-added tax rate on feminine hygiene products in Sweden. And I think that the reason for that is that when Sweden has evaluated the reduced value-added tax rates, when the value-added tax rates have been lowered on zoo entrances, on ski lifts, and also on restaurant services, when you go out to a restaurant and eat. These three areas, we have gone from the full value-added tax rate to a reduced value-added tax rate. But when that has been evaluated, one has found that it only influences the consumer price in the very short run. It doesn't take very long time until supply and demand governs the price again. So the ones that actually win on or gain from a value-added tax reduction are the companies and not the consumers. And that is probably what would happen if we would introduce a reduced rate on feminine hygiene products as well. That, well, we would see a decrease in the prices in the short run, but then the prices would go up again, and the producers of these products would be the big winners. But we have more debate in Sweden that feminine hygiene products should be provided for free. And actually, one municipality, Österåker, has introduced the provision of feminine hygiene products for free for younger persons. And that didn't cost the municipality very much at all. It costed 5,000 euro per year, probably because very many young people didn't use this possibility, but it was provided anyway. What also has happened is that feminine hygiene products are provided for free in the military service because men and women are not treated differently in the military service. So we have a compulsory military service for both men and women, but not very many are accepted to the military service. So it's mainly those who want to do the military service who actually does it so far, I would say. But previously, this was not provided for free, and I just translated a quote here, that then you should not have to go to your officer and say that you have to leave to buy menstrual protection. And also, of course, in wartime, it would be very problematic if you're out in the country, if you wouldn't have brought your feminine hygiene products. And there are also private initiatives that there are companies that make like tampon automates and provide them to the employers, that the employers can provide this protection free at the work premises. So I think that the main reason actually that Sweden has not introduced a tampon tax is that we don't consider it very efficient, and we believe that the gain of it would just end up not by the consumers, by the women, but by the providers. And the next slide, please. So that brings me to my concluding. To my concluding analysis, and that the Swedish tax system does very little for gender equality, actually, but it doesn't. It takes family circumstances very, very little into regard overall. So, I mean, it doesn't matter. You're taxed exactly in the same way if you're a single person or if you are a family with like 7 children or so. But what the Swedish tax system does very well, that is to collect taxes. You know, we have quite high taxes in Sweden and a very broad tax base. And studies have actually shown that welfare states apply systems with a great deal of its tax revenue from value-added tax and taxes on employment, and that is actually the case in Sweden. So those seem to be important elements to build a welfare state. And what Sweden does have is good and cheap public child care for everybody. Schools are always free for everybody, also private schools. A parental insurance so that you can stay at home for 1 year full time with 80% of your pay. And we also have child contribution then, and not child deduction. And you get more for each child, the more children you have. And it's the same as with the public child care, that you pay less for each child, the more children you have. And I think that those features in the Swedish welfare system actually enable women to increase their productivity, and also then make the pay gap between men and women less, because it's easy as a woman to go to work, and you don't have to stay at home with your children more than you wish recurs. So in Sweden also that direct subsidies are considered more efficient than taking family circumstances in account in the tax system. And that was all for me. So the last slide, please. So I would like to thank you very much for your attention. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Eleonor, for giving us these two illustrative examples on how taxes can negatively impact gender equality. It was really interesting to hear your presentation. This brings us to the end of presentations, and unfortunately, we are heavily behind our schedule, so unfortunately we do not have much time for discussion, but nevertheless, I would like to give the floor to you and give you an opportunity to pose some questions if you would like. Yes, please, and please introduce yourself. It's not a problem.
Hello, I'm Antonio Alvarez from the Cádiz University. I'm a teacher of labor law. It is not that I'm not hungry, so I try to be, but I would like to make a comment, so I try to be brief if I can. I would like to comment something about gender pay gap. Thank you for your great presentation. I'm not trying to criticize your presentation, but just to make a comment that I consider is complementary, okay, because I really like it. My main concern is that we could come to believe that only adjusted gender pay gap is the social problem, and I don't believe so. And I will give you very briefly 3 arguments, but I'm hungry, so I try to. First argument: discrimination not only affects pay, but also access to employment and promotion. So the difference of earnings could be explained economically, but there are discrimination in the promotion, for example. Second argument: segregation in the labor market is not always due to discrimination, but is related to systematic inequalities concerned with gender patterns. So I was talking yesterday about the difference between discrimination in a legal sense and systemic inequalities. And systemic inequalities is, of course, a social problem that we have to address I don't know why, but there are many possibilities. And the third argument: our criteria for measuring productivity could be biased. So, just as an hypothesis, just a populist example: our boss always earn more money than we. Is always he or she more productive? We know positively that is not true. From an economic point of view, from the economic model, it will be inefficient. So, but in practice, we know that's reality, because economic models are okay. There are models that are just representation of reality, but not reality on itself. Because labor markets are not spontaneously, they do not grow spontaneously. They are created. They are socially and politically created, and they are conditioned by hierarchy and relationships of power. So, because of 3 reasons, I would say, okay, it is a good model to think about the adjusted gender pay gap. I don't deny that. And it could be a measure of pay discrimination. It's not exactly the same, because discrimination has to be considered on each particular case. It will be, okay, a measure of pay discrimination. But the gross amount is also important, and we have to take it into account. It's just an opinion, so thank you.
Thank you for your wonderful comments. Would the Professor Ilić like to respond?
Yes. Briefly to address, I see your concern, and I partially agree with you. But once again, I didn't say that we should not reduce the gender pay gap that is caused by different productivity, but we should approach those 2 types in different manners, in different ways. When there is a gender pay gap that is based on discrimination, then there is no any doubt that we have violation of the principle equal pay for work of equal value, and that's clear. We agree on that. Okay. And when we have a gender pay gap that is based on different productivity, then I was suggesting that we should create incentives to enable women to be more productive, and in that way, indirectly, to reduce the gender pay gap. Because if we would reduce directly that gender pay gap, then we would equalize people that are not equally productive. In that way, we could basically violate the principle of equal pay for work of equal value. I will not argue on that who is more productive, boss or his employee. There is a market for that and things like that. But in essence, we do agree. But what I was saying is that we should have different approach when it comes to gender pay gap that is based on discrimination against women and gender pay gap that is based on different productivity. And to distinguish between those two, we need to analyze causes. What are the causes of gender pay gap and not just to calculate average wage for men and women and compare those two values and make conclusions, because on those average values we cannot conclude whether or not we violated the principle of equal pay for work of equal value. Thank you.
So we have a question here, please.
Well, not exactly the question.
Please turn on the microphone and then it will be better. Yes, thank you.
Am I heard now? Yes. I would like to stress that I observe during all this day the ignorance, let's say, or neglect of various types of discrimination. Discrimination is not only individual. If my faculty, for example, decide not to employ women older than 50, let's say so, discrimination is also of structural and cultural types, and it is not natural or just given or this is the way the things are. This structural source of discrimination is very important. When girls are said, it is best for you to best career to be to work in kindergarten, not university. This is for men. If girls are directed away of so-called STEM activities, meaning science, technology, engineering, mathematics, and money is there. If women are said it is good to be, let's say, teacher of history or geography, but let IT technology to men. These are sources of discrimination. This is not the things they should be. And at the end, we don't have, we can say, as a colleague said, women maybe don't have ambitions, maybe they agree with lower positions, maybe they don't think they could be upper level. These are structural discrimination. And discrimination too. This is not to be neglected like something natural. This is not natural, and this is the source of wage gap, one of the main sources, or various sources of biases. Women cannot be managers. Men are better to manage a bigger group. Men can carry better burden of responsibilities. Women are more emotional. Women will be afraid to make decisions. Women cannot conduct a collective of women. You know all of these things. You heard several times. And these are sources of gender pay gap. Not that women are not ambitious, not hardworking enough, or deliberately decide. Maybe yes, we decide, many of us decided for lower positions. But this is the result of structural discrimination. Structural discrimination is also discrimination. Please, I'm very disappointed that this is my law school. Here I finished first, second, and all levels, also obtained PhD. I am disappointed that people from here don't understand structural discrimination. Please pay attention to this. This is very important. And also structural sources of violence. Violence is not just one-to-one. Discrimination is not one-to-one. There are cultural and structural sources of violence and discrimination, and these are much more important sources of violence and discrimination than just one-to-one. One-to-one is a result of everything else, contextual discrimination. So I'm not criticizing you. I just want to enter that point in today's discussion, hoping that we understand each other, not on private one-to-one level, but on this rather structural and contextual level.
Thank you for your comment and for pointing to the complexity of this problematic, but you shouldn't be disappointed. I'm sure that all our panelists and all of our colleagues in the room, of course, understand different types of discrimination, but simply the time does not allow us to cover all issues. We focused on certain topics we found most relevant. Now there is a question of Professor Jovanović, please.
I just want to, I was also triggered by the productivity criterion in the presentation on gender pay gap. And since gap basically means inequality, I thought it's a kind of a province of legal philosophy to mess a little bit with this issue. So since we are in the times of Wimbledon tennis tournament, I was thinking of a very specific question, and it concerns whether men and women should be paid equally at Grand Slams. That was for quite some time a big issue. Now it's settled, but it's not on all other tournaments. That's not the case. But for instance, back in mid-70s, I think 73. American tennis player Bobby Riggs now infamously said that women play 25% as good as men, so they should be paid that much. And that was just a couple of months before he was beaten by Billie Jean King in a tennis match. Okay, he was 55, she was 29, but that was the famous Battle of Sexes, which is now in the movie. A couple of years ago, which was made, but I'm really. But even nowadays, if you want to go to the finals of Wimbledon, you have to pay £225 for a male finals, and £185 for the female finals. And I would say that Wimbledon calculated very much market principle of supply and demand, which tells us also something which we'll have to calculate in the final answer to the question whether this type of gender pay gap here is justified or not. So I'm just interested in your response to this very specific question. Thanks.
Many thanks for your question. It's really interesting. And I think that we should distinguish two things here. One thing is productivity, and the other one is market and how your work is valued in the market. So here I think that we agree that they play equally good, men and women. They do their best, and I think really honestly that they play equally good. But on the other side, we have market, we have people supporting those events, paying for those events. At the end of the day, we have consumers and their preferences. And they are willing to pay for something or not willing to pay for something. So in my opinion, they are not working the same job. They are in the same industry, but they are not working the same job. As I said, they are doing equally good. They are doing their best, but still we have consumers and market that will eventually connect some value to their work. So that, in my opinion, that's the reason why they have different salaries. It's not about productivity. It's not about discrimination. It's simply about consumers' preferences. So it's just the way it is, in my opinion.
You again don't see structural discrimination. This is the way market is not, God given. This is, source of structural discrimination, providing preferences to one sex.
We may discuss about how preferences are created and what are the consequences, but as I said, if the discrimination, any kind of discrimination, just discriminating someone because of the sex, then obviously, as I said, that is a gender pay gap and we should reduce that. But in this case, honestly, I'm not sure. I mean, you cannot force people to watch women playing tennis if they don't want to do that. So it's a market. You may do that, but it's a question whether or not you will have some success while doing that. So, in my opinion, that's as I said, they're equally productive in this way, but they're not doing the same job in terms of market and evaluation of their work. I agree on that. We have to change preferences. For example, people buying some products that are harmful, for example, buying cigarettes, drugs, and so on. Yeah, let's change their preferences. I totally agree. We should do that, but it's not as easy as it seems. So, yeah, I would like to change preferences of those people to watch equally both men and women their tennis games, but it's simply not that easy to do. I mean, it's at the end of the day, we are all participating in the market and contributing in some way to fluctuations of prices and how the work will be valued. And I agree that we should contribute to in this way to equalize men and women when it comes to tennis games. But I'm not think that we should use some force or to conclude that it's.
They are equalized by receiving now the same prize money. I was just asking the question. Actually, I forgot to tell the big difference, probably most of you know. Women playing 3 of the best sets and men playing 5 of the best sets. So that's also kind of an issue that
you get more for the money, so you get a longer match. So, but I think that we're running so much out of time that we should maybe discuss that during the lunch break. And it is interesting to see that the 2 main most discussed topics when it comes to gender discussion is the pay gap and is the quota. So because this is something what you can more or less have in the hand, not ignoring the structural differences, and also we are aware of that. But at one point we also come to the point of the next panel, I would say, that is the freedom of decision, which is one of the main principles in civil law. So that's also our grounds of how we make our decisions as economic lawyers. Let's put it in this big phrase. So, but yeah, at the end of the day, I just want to say, just keep in mind from an economical point of view, we need to unleash the potential of women to take part in economics. So we need that not only from a equality perspective, but also from a perspective of welfare. So if we take that potential, we would be more wealthier all over the world. Not only here, not only in Germany, all over the world. So thank you very much. Thank you for all the speakers. Thank you, Mirjana. Thank you, Mareike.